had some desultory experiences with making these videos, so that some things have been erased. I made some recordings that have been erased, so I don't know exactly. So I might repeat myself in some instances. When we get to this, the British empiricism version of the instincts, and the criticism of that is what's been overlooked in the primary concepts is that we take for granted the idea of the solidity or the corpuscularity, and the human Locke speak about that. And it seems obvious that you can close your eyes, and so there's a blindness is something we can think about just by closing our eyes, that this certain form of sense data would just not be there, but the world would still be there. But it's not. I think that what Locke seems to have taken for granted, at least early on, maybe he came to awareness of it. It seemed obvious to him that solidity was the most real thing. But there are people that don't have the sense of solidity. They put their hands in boiling water, they don't notice it, and they die fairly young because they don't flip over when they sleep. Apparently, they don't have this sense. They don't get this impulse that they ought to do it. That from the bodily sense of their solidity there, from the which largely overlaps with. But in any case, the British empiricist concept seems to link to this life, which Heidegger goes on to say. Nietzsche is quote unquote one-sided here. He grants to the animal's forgetfulness a perfection. To what degree is Nietzsche aware that he's doing this? We don't know yet at this point. This whole sphere, and okay, then the obviousness also links up to our. We want this zesty little formula. Nietzsche is talking about the motives, and then you can link it to the juridical concepts and so on. Is that sufficient? We see that there's a great complex of Unheimlich-rich problems here. One thing we can link it to, Alexander Dugin's thinking is very complex, but we can vaguely link it in, at least as a suggestion, to say that when Strauss makes his nice formula of Nietzsche, and he says in Nietzsche we have science understood from the point of view of art, or things that have been learned after birth, and the art, which is art is means technique. It's a much broader term than the term we're used to comes through the lens of the idea of the fine arts, which is, I think, maybe early 19th century concept, late 18th century concept. And I saw a lecture by a Chinese historian that said that this concept, the fine arts, came into the Chinese language, and they didn't have this. If you think of Jacques Derrida's thoughts about the genres, they didn't have this genre of art in the same way, because something like calligraphy isn't necessarily to be linked to something like sculpting, for instance, but this putting everything together in the fine arts, and then of course everything that extends to that with respect to the notion of creativity and subjectivity and so on, in contradistinction to the idea of that's another subject matter I want to go into, the idiosyncratic and the reasonable that I raised with Herder, but let's gloss over that for the moment. So Dugin talks about this abelian, which seems to in some way be analogous to the lowest level. Adjusting for the distinctive way he thinks about it and the complexity of the way he thinks about it and the way Nietzsche thinks about it, in some way corresponds to this bottommost, to this this level of the life, which is itself not the most clear concept, except that Nietzsche links it to this perfection of the forgetfulness, in contradistinction to the pain and the sorga of the human being with all its worries, which can never get above the art state to a true mirror and science of the Geist of of Christ, let's say. They can never bring all this everything into coordination. His thinking his life and his corpuscular existence, his bodily existence. Uh, so yeah, the Sibyllian, the Dionysian, and the Apollonian in some ways seem to correspond to these general subject matters that you have in each. As the and art is, if you think of art in this sense, which is used prior to the 18th century or so, where you have the Latin tag that's there's no there's no one's born with an art, right? It's usually something that you have to apprentice to. So you can think of even the hard sciences today, especially biology, that involves long apprenticeships. And then you can ask, are these just techniques or arts, or do they genuinely reach a science? And then you have this Heidegger, as he says here in his notes to this lecture, he says all these sciences require to be grounded in something that comes prior to them, which they can't prove, which is basically in this place of the Sibyllian, the life, wherever the sense data supposedly comes from, this loop that Nietzsche says, the senses can't be the sui sponte beginning of the senses themselves. It doesn't make any sense. The eyeball can't actually be creating the eyeball. The optic loop can't actually be creating the things that it's seeing in the outside, in the external realm. It doesn't add up. This somehow, some take on this problem seems to be the idea of the genuine philosophy, and we have the concept of the mind-body problem in the analytic, or the British and empiricist way of thinking, which is dominant on the planet today. But these are all, in a way, different ways to approach the same phenomenon, if you like. So, in a way, you could make it more, and you could bring in Jung's concept of the phylogenetic unconscious here. What's back behind the beginning? In the historicist version, the thrownness, we're thrown into this that's already there, into this, and we build up from it. Nietzsche speaks of the, as is well known, Nietzsche speaks of the the Prussian Kriegschule, and the hussars that they produced. And you think of institutions. I think Jacob Burckhardt particularly develops this, the life of institutions and the way they mold a certain kind of human being. But this all happens, as it were, at the classroom level, not at the level of the family, where the beings, where we sort of come into being, as it were, at the level of existence. So let's stick with the vagueness. Let's try to. So Heidegger advises us to not be, to let the storm wind in, as it were, and not be fearful of the inchoateness of the or the danger of this falling into complete confusion, as we may do.